So hello everyone and welcome to UN Behavioral Science Week 2025. It's good to have you with us. My name is Mary McLennan. I am moderating today's session. I'm the Senior Advisor in Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General, and I also lead the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I will come to in a bit. So for today's session, we have a packed lineup of speakers to give us a big spectrum of what behavioral science is related to contexts in which the UN works, and then also a little bit about UN 2.0. But I'll just start with a few kind of slides about the group and what we do, and then we'll get into the content. So the Behavioral Science Group, as I mentioned, brings together over 7,000 colleagues from more than 70 entities in 150 countries. So there's lots of interest and demand for behavioral science across the UN. And colleagues really range not only with respect to the different geographies in which they work, but also regarding domains of health, climate, gender, peace and security, and other areas. So lots to unpack and explore. And although we do have some behavioral scientists in the UN, there are also lots of colleagues at the early stages of their journey. So no matter where you are along that spectrum, you can be a part of the Behavioral Science Group, and I'll share some context shortly. So a little bit about the UN 2.0 Quintet of Change. So if you're in the UN, there's a good chance you've probably heard of this already. So this is essentially part of the Secretary General's plan for his second term. And it's really about a forward-thinking culture and really making the UN fit for purpose in the 21st century. So these are 5 skills the Secretary General has deemed important for the UN to be nimble and effective and really deliver on its ambitious agenda. And they are data, digital transformation, innovation, strategic foresight, and of course, behavioral science. So there's lots there to unpack, but to say this has been a big priority of very senior levels of the UN, and as we'll talk about throughout the week, a priority of also all levels of the UN as well. So happy to speak about UN 2.0 if you want to know more. Again, I'll show some links to some documents if you want to go into how the UN's thinking about this and how we can think about it in our work as well. Okay, so they said there's some links I'll put in the chat once I stop speaking, but we have lots of documents, publications you can read, including a Secretary General's guidance note on behavioral science, also behavioral science report. There's a policy brief from Secretary General on UN 2.0. There's the UN Behavioral Science Review we've published, which covers case studies from across the UN, so lots to unpack. And you can also join the group if you haven't done so already. So there's much more we can explore there too. All right, so on to today's session. A little bit of housekeeping here in terms of how we run the webinars. So we ask that if you have a question, you put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Not in the chat. I don't think you have the opportunity to use the chat, but if you put it in the Q&A box, that'd be great because we can then look at the questions there. And you can also upvote the questions of your colleagues as well. So even if you don't have a question yourself, I encourage you to put your questions in the box, and yeah, we'll get to them then. So I also encourage you to do this throughout the speakers' presentations because there'll be time immediately afterwards to ask them questions. So if you don't put them in at the time of the presentations, you might not get them to the speaker at the right place in the right time. Okay, so with that, on to our speakers for today. So we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Nava Ashraf, who's a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. She's also the head of the Altruistic Capital Lab, and we'll share some links with you shortly. So she's been working in this space for a number of years, and particularly in Asia and Africa, looking at the behavioral economics angle, as I mentioned, but also household decision-making and healthcare, some really interesting, and some of like the first studies that I've looked at, some of these interesting applications of behavioral science. So we'll unpack that with Nava for a little bit. And then we'll go over to Irina Sánchez from CEBAL in the government of Uruguay, who will speak to her experience and the experience of the government, reflecting on integrating behavioral science into other digital applications, but also in specific domains such as education. And then we'll hear from Joseph Sherlock, who's from Duke University, or actually now I think King's College London. And he'll be sharing a bit more. He's also with the UN right now as a fellow, working across on different projects. And he'll be sharing a bit more about what behavioral science is and some examples and how we can really conceptualize it in the ways that they work in the UN. Okay, so with that, enough from me. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Professor Ashraf.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you all. I'm just going to open my slides here and just shout if you can't hear me or see the slides. Can everyone see the slides? And okay, great. Yeah. I see the floating thumbs up. Excellent. So What a great time to be thinking about behavioral science and to be opening this week. It is something that has, over the last 20 years, grown tremendously, a growing body of research and practice with more than 200 government units worldwide that are proactively using behavioral science within governments. And of course, a lot of what's happening with the UN, with initiatives like the Behavioral Science Group and its member states, are able to really harness behavioral insights to create inclusive development and growth. For me, the use of behavioral science has been really a path towards making sure that we're tapping into the most broadest parts of our human nature, things that maybe we don't always think about when we are designing policy or implementing programs, but which can actually unlock a great source of motivation and productivity in all of us. And so what I'm going to do is actually, in this very short time we have together, I'm going to present two projects that have been in collaboration over many, many years. I've been really fortunate to work in Zambia for the last 20 years in long-term collaboration with the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education to use behavioral insights to design health policy. So I'll share some of those with you, and then the ideas that have come from those that have then been applied worldwide. So we'll start with the very first paper that was really about trying to understand, a new technology that had arisen, which was female condoms, in an area where there was a very high HIV rate, and at a time when this was the only way that women could protect themselves against HIV/AIDS. But there was a problem of adoption, like with many new technologies. It's a difficult technology to learn. It needs an innovative distribution method, ideally somewhere where people gather anyway, where they really trust where they're what is being said, and where they can talk about things that are a little bit difficult to talk about. And that was in hairdressers and barbershops, which those of you who work in Africa know is on every corner, and people gather there and talk about these kinds of questions. So it was a natural place. And then the question was, if these barbers and hairdressers will actually become these agents of distribution of this new technology, how do we incentivize them? How do we motivate them? Do we think of them as, being from the private sector, for example, and giving them margins? At the time, this was with Society for Family Health and PSI. They had a slogan that was "No margin, no mission," really taking from the private sector. Or do we think about some kind of volunteer army? So what we did is we surveyed all the salons in Lusaka. So we had to do this very rigorously, as rigorous as we could. So we geocoded all the salons. We randomized 1,200 salons to 4 treatment groups that sort of represent these different distribution models. And we invited everyone to the training, and that's where they learned which group they were assigned to. And then we collected monthly data on sales of, and these were subsidized sales of female condoms from both the barbershops and the hairdressers. And so these were there was like a low-powered financial treatment, which was about 10% of the sales price. It was a high-powered, so it was about 90% of the sales price. And there was this thing, we wanted to create a type of non-financial incentive that really got at people's motivations that may come from other sources, not just money. But here it was, we wanted, the nice thing about financial incentives is that they tie your marginal effort to the marginal profits you make for example, a firm or a company. Here, we wanted to tie people's marginal effort in promoting these female condoms to the marginal social impact that they're having and to the health impact. So you can see that as you get more, you tie the stars proportional to the social value. And so it turned out that those had actually twice the impact in terms of sales of female condoms than even the highest financial margin. This was a really big impact, because even the hairdressers themselves had thought that they would actually be more motivated by the high financial margins. But then after sort of seeing the results, really the sense was, well, there were lots of ways in which they could make a little bit extra money in that situation, but they had never really seen themselves as part of a social mission in the extent that they were. But being sort of just seen as a volunteer and thanked for their effort was not as powerful, as you can see in the 6.9 number, as really having something direct and consistent that was tied to the effort they were making that showed the impact that they're having. So the government of Zambia, the Ministry of Health, had seen these results, and they had been in the process of developing a new cadre of community health worker for health promotion. And, this was a time, like probably in many countries that you work in, where there was 24,000 community health workers at many different levels of skills. And they were thinking about professionalizing these community health workers into a cadre and wondering what is the right way to design incentives for them. When they asked us if we could apply the same type of non-financial incentives that we had learned from hairdressers and barbers in Lusaka, we said, we think that the situation is quite different. This is a full-time job, for example, versus that, which was kind of on top of their regular way of making money. So we don't feel comfortable, generalizing these results, but let's find out together what are the big questions that you're facing in designing this program, and can we actually generate some insights that could help you as you think about going from pilot to scale? And in that, what they said to us was their fear was that once these community health workers were upskilled and professionalized and made part of the civil service, which was the option on the table, that they would lose their connection to the community, which was such an important part of the work that they would be doing. And so what we said is, that's a great question. Why don't we use the pilot as a way to together learn what is the kind of effect of becoming a professionalized cadre? And would that actually change and crowd out your connection to the community and your desire to make social impact? So we randomized across the 48 districts in which there was the pilot of the initial cohort of these community health assistants, they were called, into half on the side where it says, want to serve your community, become a community health worker. This was a way of recruitment that was the standard way you would recruit for community health workers, really leveraging their desire to serve, but also just sort of saying, okay, you're going to become part of, become a community health worker. Now, remember that all the qualifications were the same. The only thing that was changed was the benefits that were emphasized in the posters. But on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side, there was the kind of new cadre, which was emphasizing the career possibilities that might arise out of this. And in fact, the way you can see from the benefits that you would be able to be connected to the clinical officers, the nurses, and really the motivation to advance your career. And because this was really a joint learning exercise, we wanted to use this experiment and this pilot to learn together what would bring in the best kinds of people for doing this community health work. We actually put these posters in front of all the district health officers and the provincial directors and just said, which one do you think? And you could do the exercise now of which one would you think? And we weren't even sure, because obviously we had seen a lot of what we call altruistic capital, this desire to serve coming out from, for example, the hairdressers and barbers. But on the other hand, to be able to actually pursue your career in the service of your community while remaining in your community could be a really powerful motivator, could bring in different kinds of people. And so we wanted to just leave it up to what the data could tell us. And so we ran this for a year, and basically so people were recruited differently from these different posters. Then once they were chosen by their neighborhood health committees, they were all sent to 1 year of training together. In that 1 year of training, they learned that they were all going to get the same incentives on the job, and they were going to have the exact same role, which is to, create this army of community health assistants and be part of the civil service. And then they were sent back to their communities to do household visits, community mobilization meetings, and to make health impact. And what we saw was that indeed, the career posters drew in candidates that did 30% more household visits than the control. Remember, this is all randomized at the district level, and this was in the 18 months in which we measured this. This was 20,000 more visits over the 18 months. And that's, compared to the ones who were brought in. And when you look at their A levels, for example, and their O levels, the career posters did bring in a cadre of people who were just not attracted to the standard community service poster, but they were really good at doing this work. Now, household visits, of course, are only one aspect. And what really matters is, did they make any impact with those household visits? And they did not only twice as many mobilization meetings, but indeed, when we look at the facility level data from the communities which got these kind of career CHAs, institutional deliveries in a country where 1 in 27 women were dying in childbirth, the institutional deliveries go up by 31%, children's visits to the health post go up by 24%, and under ones receiving polio vaccination goes up significantly. We also did household surveys in all of the households, and we find that in these communities where that was the type of recruitment that was done, the share of underweight children goes down by 24%. So what do we learn? Taking these together, and basically, let me tell you, so these results were really powerful for the government. After the end of the pilot, we shared this data, and the Minister of Health at the time just said to us, well, you know, my partner, Professor Musonda, now PS Musonda, Dr. Musonda, she was saying, you know, so what do we do with these results? And he said, you know, these are our data. We'll scale this. So they scaled this now 10 times as much. There are now 3,000 community health assistants in the country. And we are now actually studying the knock-on effects. What we see is that they're providing, and they professionalized it. So everyone was recruited with this professionalized posters, really being able to not be afraid that these CHAs are going to leave their communities. In fact, they're staying quite a long time. They're doing incredible work, but they just wanted a chance to really advance their career while remaining in service of their community. Not only has this scaled nationally, but in 2018, the WHO issued global guidelines for community health workers, and citing this research, stressed the importance of professional development. This was a big sea change for the WHO, who even at the time when this project was started in its pilot, was putting a lot of pressure on the Ministry of Health to only invest in doctors and skilled workers. So this was a powerful change that came about as a result of doing this experiment together. So just the takeaway, putting these two kind of research papers together, that it's not just that, you know, you have to think about, yes, it's monetary or non-monetary. In fact, both motivations are important to us. We all want to develop our careers, develop ourselves, be able to provide for our families, but also have a desire to serve. That's what we call altruistic capital, and want to make an impact. And so potentially you can make the biggest impact by leveraging what is scarce in the environment. And in this environment, career opportunities in these rural communities were very rare for people that were highly skilled, and particularly rare if you didn't want to leave your community and you want to serve, versus for these hairdressers and barbers, nobody had really had them feel a part of making a massive contribution to their community and the social impact that they could have. So that is what motivated them far more than making a little bit of extra money on the side. More broadly, as you can see, just this thing of how you can think about the type of people that are drawn in will make such a big difference in the quality of public services delivery. And so that is just a very basic insight that you can take away. Fundamentally, we believe in the lab and all the work that we've done that just like human development, health, a better environment are co-produced, right? It's not just, it's individuals interacting with health workers, with their environment, with technology to produce health, to produce development. So too is knowledge co-produced. And that's what I want to leave you on, is this broader sense of what it means to generate scientific knowledge together. Usually we think about scientific knowledge as something that's generated by academics, and we hope that that knowledge will inform and impact policymakers. But as we all know, even with events like this, there's often a real gap in how the degree to which this scientific knowledge can inform and impact policymakers. But crucially, policymakers and practitioners are themselves driving and generating valuable knowledge on the ground. That knowledge doesn't make its way into science. So we have losses and leaks of knowledge all throughout. My experience of this is that the only way we can overcome these is really by both getting down off of our pedestals and really coming to generate knowledge together in a way that actually allows us. That may mean a longer time frame. It definitely means building trust and an understanding of the institutional context and applying things that can have generalizable insights. But it certainly is a path to scale and impact national and global policy that is more than we've often been able to achieve in behavioral science. And so that's what I'll leave you with, is just the opportunities and the possibilities of co-generating knowledge together.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Nava. These inspiring remarks. Really, it shows exactly how we can take behavioral science principles, put them into practice, the importance of testing and doing that, and obviously the scaling. That's incredibly impressive to get that far from research ideas to get to that. It's great. I know you need to leave, but do you have time for one quick question? Or yeah?
Yeah, I also see that there's questions in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, so I can maybe I can bring them together a little bit. So there's a question that sounds like from someone from practice, thinking about the context, right? So you gave an example in Zambia, which is great, but thinking about this and maybe other contexts, how do you reconcile the principles and what you do, thinking about different contexts, and maybe also the role of culture or religion in this as you reflect upon applying behavioral science in different countries and places around the world? What might you say to that? Those
Yeah,
questions,
I think this is an incredibly important question because even as we've shown the massive growth of behavioral science everywhere, I think what that has led to sometimes is just kind of constantly trying out a bunch of stuff and then not really being able to generalize it and not being able to bring it to scale. And I think that's because there isn't sometimes sufficient attention given up front to really understanding the context. So it's not that, so context matters, and it matters in terms of how you design the intervention. So you need to understand the context, and I do a lot of qualitative work ahead of time in design. But then it doesn't mean that what you come up with isn't generalizable. The way you can make it generalizable is to have a good theory behind what's happening. And for us, for example, as we brought these two, we first tested and said, okay, well, we're not sure how it would apply. It's a very different context, so let's try. But also, it needs something different in this context. This is a full-time job. So even in the same country, this is a full-time job. It's a rural setting. It's obviously going to need a different set of incentives. And so, but how do we think about monetary versus non-monetary incentives in this context properly? And how do we understand more broadly what's going to work where? That is from an idea of theory of like what's scarce in the environment, what do people really want, et cetera. And that's, I think if I were to say one really strong kind of steer on the behavioral science, having watched this grow from the beginning, is just that sometimes there is a real emphasis on just constantly like real quick experiments where we don't really learn across experiments and we don't spend enough time designing properly for that context.
Completely. Yeah, there's so much there to unpack about the science and the principles and the thinking versus the reality, to your point at the end there. How do policymakers come in? How do we kind of work together to do this? And that's where you have academics working with and having that loop and that cycle really kind of come into play.
Exactly. So it is an iterative process too, where you want to be constantly, actually, this is also really helpful to always along the way be talking together about what you're finding all along the way. I want to just address the faith question. Part of it is about, deeply understanding the cultural context. But one more broader thing is that I think in many of the countries where, I mean, most of the world, faith is playing an incredibly important role in people's lives. And in fact, it's a way of tapping into something that is a fundamental part of human nature. So I'm a Baha'i, so I believe strongly in that and in all of the faiths. So to me, being able to really see what is driving people, what is motivating people is really important. And so I just also don't want us to shy away from that. Sometimes we do in kind of the scientific world, but it is such an important driver of behavior for people and desire for change and growth that it can be actually tapped into.
Yeah. That's a great point there. One that, you're right. We don't often think about in the holistic sense that you're describing too. So there are lots more questions, but I also know you need to leave out, Nava. So feel free. So it's great to have you with us, and I'm sure we can continue this conversation as we go. We have some links in the chat to Nava's research and work, and we can hopefully keep this conversation going and be part of that loop and that cycle with you as you do more work and explore behavioral science. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. All right. Okay. So some inspiring remarks from Nava. Now over to Irina from Ceibal.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depends on where you are. I will try to share my presentation. Does that look good?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So it's an honor to be here today with you at the UN Behavioral Science Week, sharing the work that we're doing at Ceibal's Behavioral Science Lab. And a special thanks to Mary for the invitation and to all of you for your interest in learning about our experience in Uruguay. And I want to start with a brief introduction about how we're working with behavioral science for educational public policies and why we launched a behavioral science lab at Ceibal. And this is how a typical classroom looks like in Uruguay. Every student has their own device. The whole school is connected to the internet through high-speed Wi-Fi connection. They have available different platforms to learn about different topics such as math, Spanish, English. They also can learn robotics and computational thinking in makerspaces using design thinking and problem-based learning approach. The teachers are always being trained by Ceibal, and they choose to integrate technology into their classroom as leverage to accelerate learning. And all of this technology and innovation is provided to the schools by Ceibal. Ceibal was founded in 2007, and we were established to integrate technology into learning and to improve educational outcomes. We started as a one laptop per child initiative, originally delivering these devices to every student and teacher, but it evolved into so much more. As I just mentioned, nowadays teachers and students are using Ceibal's technological offer in many other ways. And over the years, it has become one of Uruguay's most innovative and transformative public policies, and public support plays a key role in this. Public support are key in policy sustainability, especially in Latin America. And throughout these 18 years, many governments from different parties have passed, and Ceibal not only continues, but it strengthens itself. And just a little bit of context about our country and why we chose to use or try to use behavioral science for educational challenges. Uruguay is a country with a relatively high GDP per capita. It's now being cataloged as a high-income country by the World Bank. We have one of the strongest democratic systems in Latin America, and we also have one of the highest literacy rates of the region. However, this advantage in the political and economical arena doesn't always translate into an advantage in the educational field, and we face major educational challenges, such as students being absent of primary schools in a very high rate, and also 30% of students not finishing their secondary education. And having these and other challenges in mind, as an organization that we identify ourselves as an innovation agency, a few years ago, we decided to launch a behavioral science lab, especially devoted to improving education and educational outcomes in Uruguay. Mainly because we had lots of low-hanging fruit to collect with this approach. Ceibal had already developed most of its policies and programs, and in the last few years, we are focusing on gaining efficiency within them, mainly through adding like a user-centered perspective in our design and redesign processes. We have already developed like a very big national digital infrastructure, and this has two main advantages. On one side, we're able to enrich our intervention designs relying on this infrastructure, and it's also easier for us to scale up or to reach different stakeholders at the national level because it's everything already there. This also means that we have huge amounts of data. The usage of all of Ceibal's offer and resources is being recorded and stored, but we also have access to all administrative data related to education, such as attendance, grades, other types of data. So this is like a perfect opportunity to understand the background of our challenges and also to promote evidence-based policymaking that it's not very common at least in Latin America. And lastly, the continuity of Ceibal as a policy in Uruguay gives us a perfect opportunity to iterate year after year in our projects, and for us to be able to accumulate knowledge and refine our mechanisms and methodologies year after year. And before I finish up, just a brief overview of the things that we have been working on. We launched the lab in 2022. On the first 1 or 2 years, we focused on challenges within Ceibal's main business, such as promoting teachers' attendance to training workshops or working towards narrowing the gender gap in STEM teaching and learning. And in 2023, despite being less than 2 years old, the lab was entrusted with the confidence and the responsibility to address school attendance in primary schools, one of Uruguay's most pressing educational challenges nowadays. So in that year, we collaborated with the Behavioral Science team, and we ran an experiment to assess the impact of an intervention that targets specifically parental beliefs, and we had very good results. Luckily, this intervention was scaled up in 2024 at a national level in a specific segment of the population where the intervention was most successful. This was specifically in schools from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And now this year, we are still working towards promoting school attendance, but now specifically in high schools, where the challenge is slightly different and requires a new perspective. I would like to bring up this idea that the professor was saying. For us, it's very, very important to be always checking our context and in what sense the things that we always read on the literature in much more academic backgrounds are useful for field RCTs or field interventions that are being tested within our context. We are constantly working on diagnosis and exploring phases that allow us to know whether an intervention could be useful and it's worthy to be assessed. And that's basically what we do before running an RCT. And I agree with that it's a very, very important part of our job. I think that's all. For us, behavioral science has been a very powerful tool to dive deep into these pressing challenges that require very diverse and multiple interventions. And it gave us a seat at the table into shaping more effective educational policies and not always focusing on like traditional views or interventions. And we're right now looking forward to continuing this journey and collaborating with others who share our vision. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much. And there's my email in case you want to connect.
Great, thank you for that, Irina. It's really nice to hear from your perspective, from the government, what it's like to do this. So one question, so I was picking up on what you said at the end there, like what it's like, what value this has brought your work in government. There's a question in the chat about what makes governments fund these projects. Maybe more about your role and your conversations within government. You know, you lead the behavioral science lab. How does that go with other people? Are they immediately on board, or how do you convince them? Yeah, unpack that a little bit would be helpful.
Yeah. It's not always easy. I think this thing that I was saying, that being able to work with behavioral science within an organization that has innovation at its mission, it's key for us. So our policymakers always know that CEIBAL is driving innovation and new ways of thinking about challenges and problems. So that's part of our success is because of that, because we come from a place where they know that we're bringing new innovative ideas. And besides that, I think showing results is the most important thing. I mean, sitting at a table where everyone is concerned about a very pressing policy challenge and being able to say, I tried this and I ran an RCT and here's what I can do for this. And even though the improvement sometimes is not as big as we wish, evidence-based policymaking in Uruguay is not that common. So being able to say, here is what I can bring to the table has opened conversations and allowed us to sit at the tables as one very active partner for governments.
That's really interesting to hear, because across the UN, there are all these innovation groups that have popped up as well. We have the UN 2.0 quintet. So there are all these spaces we could leverage that kind of innovation angle too, depending on where we go. And then also the impact and the results, you know, depending on the audience, what resonates, you know, is this going to save you money? Is it going to save you time? Versus, is this innovation? Is this a cool idea that you haven't tried yet? So it's really, really interesting to hear that. And I'm sure there's lots more we can unpack, and there's nothing yeah, it comes with a good table, a good chart can really change decisions at the table. Okay, well, great. Well, thank you so much for that, Irina. We're going to go to our next speaker, but if you wanted to stick around, we have some more time in the Q&A to answer some general questions as well. So thank you for that. Next, over to Joseph. I'll share the slides over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mary. And hello, everybody. Great to be here. What a wonderful set of speakers we had just before that. So I think what we're going to do now in this last little part of the talk is to actually take a little bit of a step back. So we've had some really interesting applied examples there, behavioral science in action, behavioral science in the real world, having impact. And we're now going to sort of take a step back and sort of set the scene for Behavioral Science Week and give an introduction to behavioral science and cover some of the the main principles and give a few examples as well along the way to sort of weave this together. And again, you know, set the scene nicely for what will be really an exciting week to come next week and for the remainder of this week. So with that, if we can move on to the next slide, we start with behavioral science, and to give it one overview, we're trying to jumps off really nicely actually from what Irina was saying. We're trying to do evidence-based policy. We're trying to use evidence to help us develop ideas that solve problems, and we're looking to understand how people make decisions, how they respond to different environments, ultimately so that we can innovate. And with this approach to innovation, behavioral science allows us to have more impact as we're innovating. It allows us to be more efficient. It allows us to do more with less, to be thoughtful in that way. It allows us to save time as well as saving money, and it gives us an opportunity ultimately to simplify, design things for humans, to meet humans where they are. So this is the overview, and we're going to sort of dive into this. So where do we start? Well, we start with, if we move on to the next slide, we start with humans. And humans are understandably and naturally boundedly rational. We are in fact human. We want to do things in a thoughtful, in a logical way. And do what is best for ourselves and for others, but we are also just limited in our capacity to do that. You know, we've been endowed, we've evolved to have hardware that is limited, and as a result, we become what is known as cognitive misers, in that we are trying to navigate an increasingly complex world, a world that is you know, over time getting more and more diverse and more busy, and there's more and more things competing for our attention every minute of every day, but we haven't evolved to be able to keep up with that complexity, and as a result, we are trying to navigate this complexity by making the best decisions we can, while not sort of wasting all of our time and energy processing every small detail. And to do that, if we move on to the next slide, we rely on what are known as heuristics or shortcuts. So we rely on these sort of tools to enable our decision making. So often we will do the thing that is easiest. We will do the thing that has the least friction. We will do what other people around us are doing. So we're taking a cue from our social environment, or we will do the thing that avoids loss. You know, we as humans don't like loss. We have sort of an ingrained negativity bias, and so we'll do the thing that prevents us from feeling that sense of loss, and so we'll be shaped in that way. Okay, so taking this, if we move on to the next slide, taking this this sort of approach to innovation, understanding behavioral science in this way, we recognize that people are really influenced by the environment in which they're in. So the environment around us, like, heavily and in really important ways, shapes the decisions we make, and as a result, the behaviors that follow. And where that leads us is that all of us on this call, us as policymakers, as social innovators, as agents for change, we become choice architects. We have the opportunity and also the responsibility to design environments in thoughtful ways to shape behavior so that people are doing what is in their best interest. So, you know, to pull out some examples from some of the talks that have just gone already, by shaping incentives and by adding stars in the hairdressing salons, Nava is a choice architect. By designing those career posters and testing them relative to the control ones, Nava is a choice architect. And when Irina and team are changing school policy to improve grades or reduce absenteeism, they are choice architects. They are designing the environment in which people make decisions. And so, as I mentioned, but just to reinforce, you all are absolutely choice architects. You have the responsibility to think carefully about the environments that you can control and the innovations that you create, the policies that you design, the programs that you're in charge of. And so as you go through Behavioral Science Week for the next week, think carefully about that. Think about how you can pull ideas from evidence, pulling from what Irina said, from some of the behavioral theory, from what others around you are doing to help you think carefully and thoughtfully about your programs. So if we are all choice architects, in what direction should we be shaping behavior? Well, we've sort of implicitly a few times now talked about what is often known sort of well as rule number 1 in behavioral science, which is if we want people to do something, we need to make it easy. We see that in the heuristics. If we reduce friction, people are more likely to do it. So reducing friction, reducing sludge is an important thing. If we want people not to do something, inversely, we can also try and make it harder for them to do the thing. So if we click through to the next slide, so rule number 1 in behavioral science is make it easy, reduce friction. Rule number 2 is that we as humans are implicitly social. You know, again, we've evolved to work in groups, we've evolved to be collaborative, to work together. And as a result, we're heavily influenced by what others around us think and what others around us do. So if we go through to the next slide, one of my favorite subjects, and maybe not what you're expecting, but one of my favorite subjects is tax. I started my career in tax and ran a lot of experiments in this, and tax is unexpectedly social. So to start with, it's unexpected because tax is actually an invisible behavior. It's something that lots of people, well, nearly all of us do it every year and with some regularity, but you can't see that people are doing. You can't look around at your peers. It doesn't come up much in conversation. And so the descriptive norm, what people do in terms of paying their tax, is not very visible. And as a result, that leads to a scenario where there is often a misperception of the social norm. Often people think that everyone else isn't paying tax, and I am the only idiot that's paying tax. When that's not the case. It is far more common that the majority, if not nearly everyone, pays taxes. But there's a misperception of that social norm. So the social environment is not quite adjusted correctly. So if we click through, what we can do here as behavioral scientists, as choice architects, is update people's perception of the social norm. We can correct the misperception of the social norm. We can tell them that most people around them are paying taxes, and as a result, increase tax payment. And this is one sort of classic example from behavioral science. We've seen it bear out lots of times. On the slide now is an example from Guatemala, where they had very large, at least in relative percentage terms, increases in tax payment by showing descriptive social norms. If we click through to the next one, we see another example, this time from Bangladesh, and this time with businesses, with firms, showing that if you tell firms that tax compliance is going to be made visible, that they're more likely to pay their taxes, and most importantly, when at least 15% of firms are. So when there is a legitimate descriptive norm that people are doing this. The next slide gives us an example from Latvia. Again, similar, getting people to pay their taxes earlier this time with social norms. And the last one, deliberately pulling here, is one from Poland, where actually the social norm message didn't work so well. And it was the harder hitting example, the harder hitting message that really worked. And this pulls out one of the points that Nava made in the first talk, that really context matters. One of the big lessons in behavioral science, we're sort of interweaving here, is that context matters, context matters. And as innovators, you need to spend time and energy understanding the context and making sure that you're designing interventions for those contexts. So we need to be both evidence-based, pulling from what has worked before, like Irina said, and also really understanding the context, like Nava said. Okay, so the next slide then, to summarize this point, is that humans are influenced by those around us, and this is called social proof. So we can use descriptive social norms to shape behavior. one more quick example. I'm conscious of time, so I'll zip through this one. But another big lesson from behavioral science is that we have this intention behavior gap. We all often have intentions to do things that we don't follow through. I intended to be asleep by 9 p.m. last night and it didn't happen. We all have these intentions and we don't always follow through. And you as innovators, us as behavioral scientists, we need to find ways to close that intention behavior gap. Now, this next example, again, going through reasonably quickly, if we click to the next example, one of the ways we can do this is with implementation intentions. We can get people to write down and be specific about how they are going to follow through on the existing intention that they have. And if we click through to the next slide, we can see that using this as an intervention has, you might need to click a few times. There's a bit of logic there, Mary, that we can see that this intervention can increase things like vaccine uptake and have a reasonably large impact. Again, doing so with a very light touch intervention. So another lesson we have from behavioral science is often these small changes to context that don't cost very much can have outside impacts on behavior. Okay, click through, and this is the last slide, just sort of to pull this together then. So to summarize some of the points, some of the foundations of behavioral science are that we as humans are humans. You know, we are boundedly rational. We have limited attention and limited bandwidth, and so we need to be thoughtful about that. We as humans rely on heuristics. We take shortcuts to make decisions, and sometimes these heuristics are really helpful. You know, they enable us to navigate a complex world, but also they can sometimes lead us astray. They can lead us to be pulled in directions that are not in our best the thing that is best for us. And as a result, we all as innovators, us as social entrepreneurs, as policymakers, et cetera, we have a responsibility to be thoughtful choice architects. You all need to carry that message through into behavioral science. We can think about how you can pull ideas. And some of the big ideas that you might pull through are, for instance, rule number 1, if we want people to do something, make it easy, reduce sludge, reduce friction. If we want people to change their behavior, we should think about the social context. Where are the social norms and how can you be thoughtful about that? And brainstorm and think about ways that you can close that intention behavior gap. And remember, we should be pulling from evidence. We should be recognizing that context matters. With that, I'll pass it over to Mary.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Joey. Set this up for the week in some really interesting ways. So there's some concepts I think you'll be hearing throughout the week: social norms, and implementation intentions, action intention gaps. So this is great. I think we will be sharing clips of this, I think, all over our throughout the week, Joey. Okay, so I'm going to cover just a few slides, and then we're going to turn it over to you for questions. Anything you want to ask behavioral scientists, myself, Joey, Irina. But with that, I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit trying to go through the slides. Okay, so Joey went through some of the upfront context. When we talk about behavioral science and defining what it is, there's these principles from psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics, is kind of, we've pulled through a few of them. But the other part of behavioral science, and it's just as important, is this testing, understanding what works as well. So I'll put in the chat, I didn't do it earlier, but some of our resources. And this comes from one of our resources, which is a practitioner's guide to getting started with behavioral science. And it just highlights some of the steps involved in doing this. And these are familiar to across many behavioral science frameworks. And this is just ones that we've sort of discussed across the UN and agreed in this way. So it's about understanding the context, defining the problem. So we spoke about that earlier, designing the solution, but then also testing it and understanding what works, and then communicating and evaluating it. So just to kind of sort of summarize some of our discussion we've had so far, it's not just one part of this process. When you apply behavioral science, you go through all of them as best you can, given the context of what you're looking at. Okay, so happy to speak a bit about that, but I'm just going to speak for just a few minutes here about the behavioral science group, and then we'll turn it over to you for some questions. So the Behavioural Science Group, as I mentioned, brings together 7,000 people from 70 entities in 150 countries. So it's a big and growing group across the UN. The Secretary General, as you mentioned before, has called it a critical tool for the UN to progress in its mandate, and then also to work together across the UN, which is what we do in the Behavioral Science Group. So I see some questions in the chat about kind of how we function and work. So I'll get to those maybe in that portion. But I had some more examples, but I think we've gone through quite a few. I might leave some time for discussion with Joey. And just to kind of conclude here and say, what Joey started with. Behavioral science is evidence-based understanding of how we make decisions. It can be about increasing impact, enhancing efficiency, saving costs and time, innovation, as Irina mentioned, simplifying administration. There's been quite a bit of work on reducing administrative burdens in the UN, and there's some documents that cover that as well. I'll share with you. So hopefully this is kind of what you can take with you throughout the week. What is behavioral science? What can it do for me or the work that I carry out, and reflect upon that as we cover different topics throughout the week. So I'll put some of these resources in the chat now and turn it over to some questions. So with that, I'll stop sharing. And maybe Joey, do you want to come on? Irina, do you want to come on as well? We can answer a few of the questions. So I'm just, as I find the links, there's a question about communications divisions and how that works and like how this relates to communications, maybe more generally. There's a question there. And then also, particularly with respect to communication, how do you work with local communities when you're dealing with that? So as I find the links, Joey and Irina, how does this link to communication? Maybe Irina, to you first.
Sure. For us at CEIBAL, at least, the communications office is one of our biggest allies when doing behavioral interventions. And I want to mix this with another question that I saw in the Q&A box that was about funding and that all this sounds expensive. And also to recall this that Joseph talked about us being choice architects. At least for us in CEIBAL, we are already doing things and we are already asking people to do things. Sometimes a behavioral science experiment is changing slightly how an email is being written for a person to reflect on something else and trying them to do something different. So for us, the communications office is an ally in the sense that but a big part of our interventions are delivered through communications that are already being sent. And we're slightly changing some of the wording, some of the intention for capitalizing behavioral science and trying for people to reflect on something slightly different, to do something different, like to change their behaviors somehow. And at the same time, I know that there are lots of marketing trainings and some comms trainings that are already using behavioral science in their propositions and on the way that communications officers are writing now their communications. So I think it's like one of the biggest allies, at least for us in CEIBAL.
That's a great point. Joe, do you have thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, look, I think Irina's spot on. Some of, again, taking that perspective on the foundations of behavioral science, one of the things Irina's drawing out there is that we can make small changes to decision-making contexts and often have large impacts. In communications, one of the examples we have from the World Bank there was adding social norms messaging to tax letters or emails can change behavior. Absolutely, and that's, Irina's right, low cost, but sometimes big impact, a great space for us to run experiments. I would also pull you all also in the spirit of like entering into Behavioral Science Week, I would pull you all to think about how behavioral science can do more than just make small tweaks to context. I think behavioral science has done so much good work in that space, but I also think that we have the potential to be able to design programs and policies from the bottom up. It's much more difficult, it is more expensive, it's more risky, and it requires, one of the words that Nava used was trust, building partnerships. We need to have strong trust to be able to influence. So I would also pull you in that direction because I think it's one of the frontiers of our field.
Great, thanks for that, Joey. Timon, our colleague Timon's here from UN as well. You work in communication. Do you have anything you want to add to this conversation? Coming from a comms background, or no? No, that's all right. Okay, cool. Okay, great. So there are a couple of questions here. I'll try to. We might go over a few minutes if that's all right, Irina and Joey. If we can do this, I'll just maybe load a couple questions. So there's a couple of themes here. There's one on the long-term impact of this. So what we're doing, to what extent is there a long-term impact? And then also there's a question around sort of the realities of working in resource-constrained environments, looking at these complex problems in development settings, in particular where the UN functions. How do we apply behavioral science with these competing demands of we're getting results, also, wanting to experiment and try things out? How do you ever do interventions fast? So maybe that goes to the point about fast and cheap versus like really extensive and big studies. So I think that's a question that I think a few people might have in the audience. So yes, maybe a bit on the long-term impact. And then also, how do you kind of weigh up the costs and the resource-constrained environments, and how do we do this using all the different methods we could take? So yeah, over to you. Who wants to go first with that one? Joey? Maybe start with Joey.
Sure. So on the long-term impact, you're hitting a good nail there. It's one of the critiques the field has had, is that, again, if we think about our history, we have worked in lots of environments where we've made small tweaks to context and we've changed letters or communications, for example, and we've had impacts on behavior. We've run experiments that have shown impacts on behavior, but often we only measure that sort of one discrete behavior. Did you pay your taxes? Did you sign up for such and such? And we haven't done a great job of measuring change over time. That is one of the frontiers of the field and one of the things that we're increasingly working on. And there are ways to do it. Commitment devices are a really nice example where we can create social commitment between two people or a person and an organization or something along those lines. And that commitment device acts as a sort of a binding factor that helps us change continuous behaviors, not just those one-off discrete behaviors. Look, there's lots more, and there's lots to dig into in the week to come. But absolutely, it's a great question. It's a great tension point. I would encourage you to needle on it. So I don't go too far, I'll pass over to Irina.
No, I agree. I think it's, at least for us, it's one of the main concerns about our work. We've been working with behavioral science since 2022, so we're pretty new in this. It's not that we can assess long-term our interventions because they're happening like yesterday, but it's one of our concerns. Scaling up interventions is also one of our concerns. In what sense what we assessed as an RCT is also going to be to have the same impact when we scale up, and on what sense that it's going to be working in the same way throughout during the different years. And we don't have the answer for that. What we are doing, and I think it's one of the right paths for this, is we are monitoring in what sense the interventions that we did and we assessed and worked, we scale, and in what sense that scale up is still working, and on what sense our users that are being or receiving the interventions are also satisfied with these interventions, and on what sense it's like becoming one of the nowadays things that we are reading, and it's not like, it doesn't have the salience that it had on the first time that they saw it. But yeah, I think monitoring is the key for us to understand in what sense this has a long-term impact or not.
Yeah, I think those are all interesting points. Maybe I'll come in here too. Let me make a comment as well as like moderators and privileges. I think there's also a bit around like iteration too. I think there's also a bit, we do an intervention and populations change, behaviors change. You do it again. It's not an experiment to end all experiments. It's the things are constantly evolving and changing, and it's reflecting upon those trade-offs as well. I think we may have lost Irina. But I think that means maybe we're good for today. Let's maybe pack it up. Anything else you wanted to add, Joey or Timon, before we close out for today?
Maybe just for my part, if there are more questions, I'd be happy to follow up on email or chat to folks offline. joseph.sherlock@kcl.ac.uk, just if you want to chat. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for all your participation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe. You can put anything in the chat that you'd like. And thank you, Timon, for keeping us all organized and all of our tech functioning well. So yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining, and hopefully see you later. We'll see you next week. We have another session tomorrow about getting to know the behavioral science groups. If you want to meet the team and kind of engage with us overall, you can join that one tomorrow at same time tomorrow. And then the official high-level opening of Behavioral Science Week is on Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Okay, so with that, thank you very much. And yeah, see you soon. Okay, bye for now.